Good evening. For those of you I've not yet met, my name is John Heibush. I am the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, and it is my pleasure indeed to welcome all of you here this evening. Once Mrs. Reagan and her special guests arrive at their seats, if you would all please remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance, we would greatly appreciate it. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to welcome former First Lady Nancy Reagan, escorted by her special guest, Mark Halperin and John Heilemann. Now, in honor of our men and women in uniform who defend our freedom around the world, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize some special guests we have with us here this evening. I'd like to start with Charles Price, the former ambassador to the Court of St. James with the United Kingdom under President Reagan, and his wife, Carol. Ambassador, Carol. I believe we have Orgora City Council member Dennis Weber here as well. Dennis? The wife of our esteemed Congressman Elton Gallegly, Mrs. Janice Gallegly. Janice? And Dr. David Arnold, the president of Eureka College, President Reagan's alma mater. I think that all of us probably have our own way of measuring just how great a book really is or is likely to be. Some measure a good book by how many hours they're willing to stand in line in front of a bookstore when the book is first published. Some rely on word of mouth from trusted friends or family members or, of course, book reviews. And some watch the charts for the New York Times bestseller list. For me, it comes down to whether a book passes the airline test. Now, perhaps some of you have used this tried and true method as well. For those that haven't, it works like this. You book yourself a flight from, say, Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., and you bring the book along. Once it's wheels up, you open up to page 1. Now, if, as you're nearing Washington on this interminably long flight, you have about 20 pages left before you finish reading the last chapter, and you find yourself praying for a massive headwind, a thunderstorm, the pilot has to fly around a closed or congested runway, anything that will force your plane to circle the airport and delay the landing until you can finish the book, well, you have found yourself a great read. John Heilemann and Mark Halperin's book, Game Change, is exactly that. As a lifelong fan of politics, I personally could not put it down, and my bet is that many of you here that have read it have felt exactly the same way. If they had written a book twice its length, I can assure you I would be hoping my DC-bound plane would fly just all the way to Rome. Now, it is obvious that great books like this, like Game Change, don't just happen. I am sure that both John and Mark would agree that it certainly doesn't hurt to start with great material. Regardless of whether you are a Republican, a Democrat, or independent political junkie, you just had to be thrilled with the historic, unpredictable, topsy-turvy, game-changing campaigns of the year 2008. This was the election in which remarkable facts and firsts and circumstances and decisions and personalities all seemed to conspire together to make for real-life material more exciting and more electric than any work of fiction could hope to provide. You quite literally could not make this stuff up. And great books like theirs obviously don't write themselves either. At their heart, books like this that pass the airline test stem from the combination of personal qualities and writing skills of the authors that are honed over many, many years of source gathering and development, reputation building, a deep and highly developed knowledge of how politics is played and how campaigns operate, and in the end, just plain hard work. For his part, Mark Halperin has been an editor-at-large and a senior political analyst at Time magazine since 2007. He worked for ABC News for almost 20 years, where he covered 5 presidential elections and served as ABC's political director for 10 years. There is not a major political story during that time frame that Mark did not cover. John Heilemann is the national political correspondent and columnist for New York Magazine. A noted author of the book Pride Before the Fall, The Trials of Bill Gates and the End of the Microsoft Era, John is a former staff writer for The New Yorker, Wired, and The Economist. Now, I remember when Game Change first hit the stands and I read it, I thought to myself how much Mrs. Reagan would just love this book. So I got all excited about telling her what a great read it was, and true to form, too late, she'd already read it. Mark and John, I am happy to report to you that she absolutely loved it as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the authors of Game Change, Mark Halperin and John Heilemann. Thank you, John. Mark, we'll get him.
Thank you all for coming. Really nice of you. John, thank you for that nice introduction. You read it just the way I wrote it, which I appreciate. That is a joke that I tell occasionally, I actually borrowed from former California Governor Gray Davis. I see some panicked faces out there. That is my only Gray Davis joke, so don't worry. The rest of them come from someplace else. We're both really honored to be here. The book has been out for a while, and we've done a lot of appearances all over the country, but I can speak for both of us when I say there's no place we've been invited to speak where we've been more honored to be welcomed. And Mrs. Reagan, it's incredibly nice of you to host us, and it's nice to hear you like the book. Someone had told us that a little while ago, and again, I can say we're lucky enough to hear a fair number of things from people about how much they like the book, but your appreciation for it, given how much you know about the things we wrote about, is really special to us. So thank you, and again, thank you for hosting us. We always love to speak anywhere. We love to speak in places that played a role in the last campaign, and of course the library did. The last time I was in this room was for a presidential debate that was hosted here, and it's a testament to the president's legacy and Mrs. Reagan's continued importance in the Republican Party that they were able to draw those events, and they were pretty important debates as well because of the time in which they occurred and how the characters played out. I go to a lot of presidential libraries for all the recent presidents, and there is no library in a more beautiful setting or pays tribute to a more important president that any of us has ever seen in this library. So it's great to be back and an honor to be back and to share a little bit about the book with you all. We'll both talk for just a bit about the book and about politics, and then happy to take your questions about whatever you'd like. It's always a little difficult, particularly as time passes since the release date, to talk about the book, because some of you have read it and some of you haven't. I want to get a little bit of a sense of who has, so I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you're uncomfortable voting in front of others. Close your eyes when you do. Raise your hand if you've already read the book. All right, and raise your hand if you haven't. All right, so most of you haven't. Now, for those of you who have, in terms of expectations, our talk will include less profanity than is found in Game Change. I hope that doesn't disappoint you. All the profanity we used was from the mouths of the candidates and their spouses, and for those of you who haven't read it, you'll see that there's quite a bit. For those of you who haven't read it, don't worry, we're incredibly careful. We won't give away the ending, at least not in its entirety. I will say Hillary Clinton becomes Secretary of State. It's kind of a shocker and a twist at the end, but there are some things in there that you'll find that maybe you didn't know. And I want to talk about why we decided to write the book and then how we did write it. And then John will talk about kind of the more present and future of politics. We thought that there was a lot about this campaign that we didn't know. This was in the spring of 2008 when John and I decided to write the book. And at that point, Senator McCain had basically sewed up the Republican nomination after really one of the most remarkable comebacks in American political history, overshadowed, though, for the most part, by what was still going on at that time in the spring of 2008, which was the ongoing fight between then Senator Clinton and then Senator Obama for the Democratic nomination. And it was, to our minds, an incredibly exciting story. The world was following it, not just the people in this country, but the world was following it. And we felt like a lot of political reporters, almost any political reporter covering this race at one time or another said, well, maybe I should do a book about it. Doing books about campaigns, kind of tough. There hadn't been a commercially successful book about an American presidential campaign in some time. And the proliferation of media made it seem like impossible to say anything new, that there was coverage of everything that happened in real time, so why would anyone want to read a book about it? And what we decided was that there was an opportunity for us for a number of reasons. The most prominent, we thought, was because of the unanswered questions. We covered this race closely every day. We read everything and watched and listened to everything our colleagues did. And there were some really big questions at that point that we didn't know the answer to. What made Barack Obama think that he could beat the Clintons, both Clintons in effect, to become the Democratic nominee and get elected president, given his relative lack of experience, given his race, given his name? What made him think he could do it? What deliberations had gone on? What role did President Clinton play in his wife's campaign in 2007 when we had the sense that he wasn't very involved? And then in 2008 when he got very involved. And why was there a change? Why did he go from being really almost as uninvolved as you'll see at that level from a presidential candidate spouse to being so involved that he was effectively the campaign manager? We didn't know the answer to that. Later on, we were interested in the question of why John McCain picked Sarah Palin as his running mate. We didn't really understand what went into that decision-making process. Our idea was that if you took the campaign as covered, in some ways overcovered as any had ever been, but doubled back to the big questions, that we could try to get the answers to those ones I mentioned, probably the biggest ones we explored, but also a lot of other things that happened. Behind every story that we all saw in real time, with so much coverage, television, radio, magazines, internet, there was the backstory. And we felt that there was a chance to get at that. We also felt like, and John alluded to this, that there was a great story to tell because the story of Game Change has the two elements you want in any great story, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. A great plot. The number of twists and turns, the so-called game-changing moments that gave us the title, really is unparalleled in any campaign that any of us have ever seen. From Barack Obama winning the Iowa caucuses and presumed to be steamrolling to the nomination, to Hillary Clinton coming back 5 days later to winning the New Hampshire primary, the selection of Sarah Palin, the financial crisis in the fall, as I mentioned before, Senator McCain's comeback. This was really an extraordinary series of events that we saw. And then again, as we felt like behind those public events, there must be extraordinary private events. The other thing, and probably the most important thing in Game Change, and to the extent the book has had success, John and I are certain this is the reason, was the number of great characters in this campaign. Not just candidates, but spouses. And really, I think it's fair to say and safe to say that in the history of presidential campaigns, you've never had so many spouses who were famous in their own right. A former president of the United States, in the case of Elizabeth Edwards, really more famous and more popular, at least before our book, than her husband. And knowing laughter from those of you who've read it. And truly, up and down the roster on both sides, incredible candidates. John and I joked while we were writing the book that if you've got a presidential campaign where Rudy Giuliani is the 7th most interesting character, you know you've got a pretty interesting campaign that you're covering. And that really sustained us and caused us to focus on the big characters. Our attitude was, A lot of interesting people out there, but we decided to focus on the people we thought had a chance to win the White House. And in retrospect, that was a clearer list than at the time. The Clintons and the Obamas and the Edwardses on the Democratic side. And then on the Republican side, really, John McCain almost collapsed, and the fact that no one beat him when he was down, as strong in some ways and as great public lives that Rudy Giuliani and Mitt Romney and the others had, none of them were strong enough to beat Senator McCain, even though he was in such a weak position. Governor Romney does not play a very big role in game change, but we suspect he'll be playing a bigger role in the next campaign. I'll just tell you one quick story about him. He was here a few weeks ago, and he's got, as many of you know, his own book. And he, part of his problem, like with anyone who's running for president for the first time last time, is he wasn't very well known. He's running against John McCain, a war hero, and Rudy Giuliani, America's mayor. Difficult in a field like that often for these first-time candidates to stand out. So Governor Romney, in preparing for this next race, has written his own book, as I said, and it's called No Apology. Now, not all of you are going to be able to see this, but I'll hold it up in part to show off this nicely California product, my iPad. No Apology, with a big picture of Mitt Romney on it. And a few weeks ago, I was reading the book on one of those, I gave it the plane test. I was flying from New York to Los Angeles, and I was reading it on takeoff, and the flight attendant walked by and looked at the cover photo and the title, and she said, apparently confusing Mitt Romney with John Edwards, no apology, not even to his wife? Now, I try not to make predictions about politics because, as the political philosopher Yogi Berra says, predictions are difficult, especially about the future. But I'm willing to say that if Governor Romney is still being confused with John Edwards when the Iowa caucuses come around in 2012, he's not going to be the Republican nominee. As much as we did write about the Republicans in the book, we write a lot more about the Democrats. The race between John Edwards, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama really was an extraordinarily complicated and interesting race. And we felt like the real heart of the story was about the Clintons and Obama and that competition. And in fact, when we thought of the book, as I said in March of 2008, we felt like it was a possibility that the general election would be kind of almost just a coda on the book, that whoever won the Democratic nomination would likely, in a year when President Bush was so unpopular, the economy was bad, the Iraq war was turning people off, that it was possible that the general election would just be kind of the end of the book, and that the real heart of the book and drama would be just in the Democratic nomination fight. Well, the selection of Sarah Palin and the world financial crisis and the way it tested both of Barack Obama and John McCain caused us to ramp up our coverage and inclusion of material from that period. But really, as I said, the Democratic nomination battle is the heart of the book. And we had an advantage there a little bit because John and I have known both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton for a pretty long time. Not as long as some of our colleagues, but for a long time I covered the Clintons in Arkansas. And when they first started out in national politics, and John was at Harvard at the same time as Barack Obama and knew him some there. So we had that advantage. But what we really had, I think, was broader relationships than that, not just within the Democratic Party, but within both parties. So many of the books that succeed today that are about politics are partisan books by someone with a right-wing talk show host or a left-wing figure with an internet blog. And what we hope to do is write a book that would be nonpartisan and of interest to people in both parties, people who aren't interested in politics even. And we hope we succeeded in that. And what we did was pretty old-fashioned and something that's hard to do in day-to-day and week-to-week journalism, even month-to-month, which is we did a lot of interviews. We did over 300 interviews for the book. We interviewed many people more than once, and long interviews. And these were not confrontational. They were not interviews where you walked in and said, had to beat the person about the head and shoulders verbally to get them to answer. We just asked, tell us the stories of what happened. And as we did more and more interviews and accumulated more and more material, we learned more and more about what happened. And the stories we learned that we didn't know, as people who followed it closely, were staggering to us. Now, professional decorum dictated that we never let on to the people we were interviewing that they were telling us stuff that we didn't know before. So we'd said poker face, very interesting, thank you. We may need to come back and interview again. And then typically we'd walk out into the hallway. We'd walk about 7 steps away from wherever the meeting was, and then we'd silently go like this. And luckily no one ever caught us doing that. But we had just an incredible experience. And in some ways it was exhilarating. And in some ways it felt a little bit embarrassing, like we'd covered the campaign with bags over our heads. Because as I said a couple times, we covered it so closely that we were stunned to find out all the things we were stunned by. But also, again, obviously I think A lot of the reason people like the book, to the extent they do, is because there is stuff in there that they didn't know. And it's great to be able to tell at least part of the story of what we say in our subtitles, The Race of a Lifetime. I thank you all again for coming and listening to us. Before I turn it over to John, I'll come back for the Q&A. And Mrs. Reagan, again, thank you so much for hosting us. We really appreciate it. So with that, let me turn it over to John, and then we'll take some questions after he speaks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And Mark has been incredibly expressive and generous in terms of what he said about how honored we are to be here. I will not bore you with a lot of repetition except to say I feel exactly the same way. It's a great thrill to be here for both of us. Mark said before that he liked to generally see who was in the audience. He asked about whether people had read Game Change or not. I'm going to ask a different and slightly more personal question just to get a feel for the ideological composition of our audience. And again, as Mark instructed, if you feel uncomfortable voting in front of other people, you can close your eyes. How many people in the audience here today voted for John McCain for president? And how many people in the audience here voted for Barack Obama for president? That is a admirable show of bipartisanship here at the Reagan Library, and I'm pleased to see that we have that kind of spread. Mark also mentioned I'm going to talk not about how we wrote the book, but about try to answer one of the most persistent questions that we've been asked after writing the book, which goes directly to the question of Barack Obama. And I'm going to talk a little bit about his presidency, but in the context of Game Change. And the question that generally gets asked us is, you spent a lot of time writing this book. It's very interesting. But what can we see in Game Change? What do we learn about Barack Obama that has proven to be relevant for how he has governed over the first 18 months of his presidency? It's a question that's been asked enough times that we finally actually have come up with some answers for it. Mark mentioned that I've known President Obama for a long time. It is true. We met in 1988 when he was a beginning law student, a first-year law student at Harvard. I was a first-year student at the Kennedy School of Government. At that time, on most days, I could be found standing in front of one public Harvard building or another, clutching a pack of Marlboro Reds and smoking cigarettes furiously. And a mutual friend walked up with this tall, skinny African-American and said, "I'd like to introduce you to my friend Barack Obama." And Barack Obama looked at me and said, "Hey, can I bum one of those cigarettes?" And I said, "Sure." And I handed it to him and I said, "This is going to be the first African-American president of the United States." That's how I like to tell the story now, as proof of my prescience. I'm going to talk about 5 things, having watched Barack Obama for all those years and then studied him more closely in the context of the book, 5 things that you see in Game Change that have been relevant in terms of how he is governed. And I'll start with shorthand, and these are a little unfair, each one of these. But the first thing I'll say is that what you see in Game Change is that Barack Obama doesn't really like politics very much. And what I mean by that is you see throughout the year 2007, the first year of the presidential campaign, a guy who had been largely propelled to public fame because of a tremendous speech that he'd given at the Democratic Convention in 2004. You see him recoiling in a lot of ways from the artifice of politics, from the public performance aspect. So you see Obama in that first year the expectations that he would give a speech every time, 5 times a day, from which people would leave in tears. He found that expectation oppressive. He found the debates to be ridiculous and trivial and trivializing, and he thought that the media was absurd in terms of how it judged him on what he saw as superficial performance skills rather than on the substance of the things that he was trying to talk about. I think it's an admirable thing that he got into the race largely, whatever you think of him ideologically or politically, he got into the race largely because he wanted to have a more adult, nuanced, serious conversation about the future of the country than he thought presidential campaigns generally offered. And the problem with that is that although it was very high-minded, it made him a very poor candidate. And you see very much in Game Change what a bad candidate Obama was throughout most of 2007, precisely because he kind of rejected what I called before the artifice of politics. And the reason I mention this as my first point is you see it very much again throughout Obama's presidency these first 18 months, an unwillingness to ever want to try to be too populist. an unwillingness to try to speak, I mean, surprisingly to a lot of people, to speak in the inspirational tones that meant so much to a lot of his supporters. I think you see it most pointedly in the question of the BP oil spill, where the demands of people in the media that he act more empathetic, or that he show more emotion, or that he be more angry at BP, or that he pound his shoe on the table, he looks at those things as kind of ridiculous and says, that has nothing to do with how we're going to actually get this problem solved. I think for a lot of people, that is intellectually satisfying but emotionally unsatisfying position, and I think in many regards it's been a political problem for him that he's not been more emotional, more human, and more in touch with that kind of with some of the attributes of politics that do demand performance, whether you like it or not. A second thing I'll say is that Barack Obama does not like people very much. And again, that's a little unfair, but it's not entirely unfair. The Obama campaign very much styled itself as a bottom-up operation. It was supposed to be a grassroots thing, and we think of Obama as having been this community organizer who brought people together in this kind of big group hug that was his campaign. In fact, what you see in reading Game Change is that this is a man who, to a remarkable degree, ran his presidential campaign as a very tightly knit, top-down organization with very few people that he trusted whatsoever. In all the presidential campaigns that I have covered, and I'm sure that Mark has covered, going back over the course of 20 years, I have never met a presidential candidate who did not want to talk to his media consultants, who did not want to talk to his pollsters. Barack Obama had a lot of pollsters and a lot of media consultants. He had no interest in speaking to them. There were 4 people he wanted to talk to, and only 4 people that he really trusted. David Axelrod, his chief strategist, Robert Gibbs, his communications director, David Plouffe, his campaign manager, and Valerie Jarrett, who was as much a friend as a political advisor. That was the circle that Obama relied on, and those were the people who he sought advice from and the people he really trusted. That worked extremely well during the course of the campaign, and he's carried it over very much into the White House. There are, again, 4 people in the White House that Barack Obama really wants to listen to and that he really wants to talk to. He wants information funneled through those 4 people, and they are, in fact, 3 of them are the same people. David Axelrod, Robert Gibbs, Valerie Jarrett, all still in place in the White House. Rahm Emanuel is a slightly more profane version of David Plouffe. This is, again, a very clear and decisive kind of management style, a close circle, and one that is governed largely by an enforced collegiality. Part of the reason why Obama likes this small circle is because it's hard for him to really trust people. He is not someone who casts the net widely for advice by instinct. And also because if you have a small circle, you can enforce a kind of collegiality. He was worried from the very beginning of his campaign that fractiousness and infighting would be a problem. And you see, if you read Game Change, just what a huge problem it was for Hillary Clinton's campaign. Obama's campaign managed to evade that largely through this tight structure. The question, I think, in the context of the White House, and it's a question that gets raised over and over again and has been raised over and over again in these first 18 months when Obama has had difficulty, is whether it's possible to run in a White House, let alone an entire federal government, while only relying essentially on the advice of 4 people. And there are many people, I think, across the ideological spectrum who have raised this point that at some point Obama will need to broaden that circle and start to hear more contrary voices, start to hear from people who are not just true believers in Barack Obama. The third thing I want to talk about is the notion of Barack Obama as a stay-the-course kind of president and a stay-the-course candidate. There were really, in the course of the 2008 campaign, as we report in Game Change, there were really only 3 rough spots that Obama had, but 2 of them were long and sustained. One of them was the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, and was kind of a unique circumstance. But the 2 bigger ones and longer ones were in the fall of 2007 and the fall of 2008. In the fall of 2007, Hillary Clinton ahead by 35 points in the national polls. Democrats who supported Obama, his donors, many of his biggest fans and friends were saying to him in that fall, you must change course. You must adopt new tactics, adopt a new strategy. You must attack the Clintons. You must be more populist. You must get closer down to the ground. Obama's attitude was, we have a strategy. We've had it throughout this campaign, and we're going to stick with it. And it's either going to work or it's not going to work. I'm not going to change course. And that worked very well for him. They won the Iowa caucuses, and he was off to the races. In the fall of 2008, the exact same thing occurs again. Sarah Palin, John McCain exit the Republican convention. A week after Sarah Palin, a national phenomenon, McCain had a very good convention. They were up by 2 or 3 points in the national polls. A lot of people forget that there was a period of time where the Republicans were actually in the lead. And again, Democrats panicked in Washington. There was a vocal hue and cry saying to Obama that he had to change course. He had to talk more about economics. He had to attack McCain more. He had to attack Palin more. And once again, Obama's attitude was, no, we're not going to change course. We have our strategy. We've stuck with it this long. We're going to stick with it and not change course. In the course of the presidency, we've seen this again and again with Obama. It's the same, very much the same thing. Under pressure from his allies and his friends to change course, his attitude is to stick by the decisions he's made before, right or wrong. And again, I think the most dramatic example of this is in the context of health care. After Scott Brown wins the special election in Massachusetts, many of Obama's advisors in the White House, and certainly much of the Democratic Party, was telling him, you know, we've lost this argument. You've fought for health care for a year. It's not going to be passed now. We don't have 60 votes in the Senate. You must either scale back your plan dramatically or you must abandon it completely. And once again, Obama says no. And does something, sticks to his guns and sticks to his convictions about what the right course is. I believe that to a large extent that the lessons that Obama learned during the campaign about the importance of constancy are what inform those decisions. And they are not always the right decisions. I think anybody who has been in a White House knows that there is, sometimes when you see people around you panicking, a panic sometimes is the appropriate reaction. Anyone who's covered Washington long enough has seen White Houses that have come to a place where they realized they needed to make a significant mid-course correction. And I have no doubt that Obama will come to that point at some point in his White House if he hasn't come to it already. And the question that will face him then will be whether he is adaptable and flexible enough to make that. We've not seen that side of Obama, the ability to make the big mid-course correction and change significantly and move to a different kind of future. That will be a huge test for him. The two last things I'll mention are both kind of conjoined. One of them is that Barack Obama is a lucky guy. And by that I mean, unlike many of the most successful and greatest presidents, including the president for whom this library is dedicated, adversity was a huge part of what made them political figures of great stature. They lost things that were important. They lost big elections. They had to go through years of struggle to get to the point where they were the nominees of their parties, let alone the presidents of the United States. Barack Obama has never had that. He has had very little political loss in his life. He had lost one primary campaign for Congress in Chicago, but beyond that, he's really lost nothing important. He's really suffered no major political setback. And as I said, both for President Reagan and for another very successful president of a different party, President Clinton, to large extents, they were defined by facing adversity, by being knocked on their back and having to get up and move forward. President Obama has never had that, and it seems to me inevitable that he will. It may come this November in the midterm elections. It may turn out that the peace bill is in fact what that's that adversity. It may be something to do with Afghanistan. But when that moment comes and he's really knocked flat on his back, we will learn a lot about his political character that we've never had a chance to learn up till now. And the final thing, which I said was kind of related, gets to another question that I think is very pertinent with respect to both the President Reagan and also to President Clinton. Mark wisely often says that presidential candidates do exactly as much as they need to do to win and nothing more. And that was very much the case with Barack Obama. And very much the case with almost all presidential candidates. However, you have in the case, and I'll talk about Obama in a second, but in the case of two very successful presidents like President Reagan and President Clinton, you have leaders who had been marinating in the juices of their party's debates and the great struggles to define their parties for decades. And by the time they became the nominees of their parties and then presidents, they had a very clear idea what they believed about the role of government, about where America was in its historical trajectory, about how the policies that they believed in were married up to their core convictions about what government should and should not do. President Reagan and President Clinton had very different views about that, but they were both very clear enough that we can talk about Reaganism and have everyone in this room know what it means, and to a large extent be able to talk about Clintonism and have people know what that means. Barack Obama never had to do that. He never had to come up with a real theory of the case in the course of his presidential campaign. What he had to do, as we see in Game Change, is in the course of the nomination fight, prove to people that he was not a Clinton. And then in the course of the general election, prove to people that he was not a Bush, or anyone who looked like Bush or smelled like Bush or sounded like Bush. That left him with no need to develop a real theory of what Obamaism is, about where America is in the world right now, about how his policies and his principles hang together and provide a path going forward. And I think that although it was enough for him to become first the nominee and then the president in 2008, it has been an enormous problem for him in the course of 2009 and 2010. This is a president who, for the people who support him most intensely, there is an enormous amount of confusion about who he is and what he believes. You have Democrats who are on the far left who believe that he is a compromising centrist. You have Democrats in the center who believe that he is an unreconstructed leftist. After 18 months in office, the fact that the people who like Obama best cannot tell you who Obama is a significant problem. And I think for many Americans who are not intense supporters of the president, the confusion is even more acute. People still at this point don't know what he believes and where he wants to take the country. And as he heads towards re-election, and as the problems continue to mount, as they inevitably will, I think that act of definition, that sense of trying to explain to people in a more clear and concrete way who he is and how his policies reflect that and where he wants to take the country, that is probably the most essential thing that he'll have to do if he hopes to be reelected. If he does not do that, I predict that he will have some significant troubles in the course of trying to get reelected in 2012. With that, I will say once again, thank you so much, Mrs. Reagan, and everybody else for coming out today. We couldn't be happier to be here, and we also couldn't be happier to take as many questions or whatever questions you happen to have over the next few minutes. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions for those of you who might have some. If you would, raise your hand if you have a question, but please wait for someone to bring you a microphone so we can hear this right over here.
Yes, my question is about Mark Penn, the Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. As someone who teaches political science, I'm a little surprised by his lack of knowledge as far as the counting of the delegates, thinking that it was a winner-take-all primary for the Democrats when, of course, it was not. Can you explain how this man who made such a huge salary was so ill-informed about some very basic things?
Well, without responding directly about Mark Penn, the first part, I'd say it's not necessarily the case that huge salaries are correlated with competence. I used to work in network television, so I bring some knowledge to that. You know, you said he was campaign manager. He was actually, his title was like chief strategist. And part of what Hillary Clinton very much wanted her campaign to be like her husband's campaign because that had succeeded. And it was very much unlike what her Senate office was. Her Senate office was famously buttoned down, loyal, organized, efficient. But when she became a presidential candidate, she went back to the more Bill Clinton style of competing team of rivals with the emphasis on rival rather than team. And she knew when she made Mark Penn the chief strategist and Patty Solis-Doyle, her longtime and loyal aide, the campaign manager, that she was putting at the top of the pyramid two people who did not like each other, did not respect each other, did not work well together. It's kind of the opposite choice John alluded to of what Barack Obama did. Mark Penn is a brilliant guy. He knows a lot about politics. He doesn't have a lot of experience in Democratic primary nomination fights. He's very good at general election and finding swing voters. And so he would say, and his supporters would say, he wasn't in charge of the delegate operation. But there was no one else who was in charge of it, and he did have extraordinary influence. So, you know, my view of these campaigns is it's the candidate's responsibility. So if Mark Penn had weaknesses in his role, and he did, you know, Hillary Clinton should have seen that and shouldn't have invested in him that much authority. You cited one example. He knew much less, shockingly little, about how the nominating process worked, that it was delegate driven. But you could go through almost everyone she put at a senior level in her campaign and find the same kind of gaps in their knowledge and their experience. She had very few people at the top of her campaign who'd done national presidential campaigns before at a senior level. And I think that clearly hurt her up against that core team that John mentioned that that Barack Obama had. But the real answer is there is no answer. It's inexplicable and inexcusable.
Over here.
Hi, I think your book was so wonderful because of your true perspective and experience, and I think that's unusual in books today, to have authors that are actually knowledgeable on the subject.
Or can fake it.
So with the two of you, I have two different questions. Mark, would you perceive 2008 as a perfect storm? It's kind of an extraordinary, kind of one-off event, between Obama, the Clintons, the whole financial crisis. And John, from your experience looking at campaigns in the primaries, how do you feel about the primary system as it played out in 2008? Would you have a perspective on how things maybe should be changed in 2012?
I can answer mine quickly. Thank you for the questions and for your nice words about the book. Since John and I have already signed to write a sequel about the 2012 campaign, I'm quite certain 2008 is not a one-off, and the next will be equally exciting.
In that same light, or that same vein, I think that any nomination process that involves an enormous amount of time, a huge amount of pressure, extraordinary emotional demands, and psychological turmoil for the candidates is all for the good, from the standpoint of nonfiction, narrative nonfiction. You asked you're being more serious about it. Look, I think it would be a very good thing if our politics found a way to not take the amount of time. I'm not sure I don't have a solution for how this would happen. I think for the truth of 2008 is that by the end of the 18 months that it took really for the Democratic race to finish, there had been an extraordinary amount of money spent and an extraordinary amount of time that was very exciting from the standpoint of narrative nonfiction, but may not be the most, the cleanest system. But I don't mean dirty in terms of corrupt, but I mean the kind of system that necessarily produces the best outcome. I think we learned some things about the virtues of primaries and the virtues of caucuses. I think there were some things that the Clinton campaign complained about in terms of how delegate rules work and how delegates get seated that are reasonable. But I think the main thing that I personally would love to see is a way for a system to arise where small states could be represented in the way that they currently are, but perhaps there could be some variety in terms of the order in which they get to take their place, so that the system wasn't quite as set in stone, and giving disproportionate impact to the same couple of states at the beginning every 4 years.
Thank you. Right over here. Sorry, it's right behind you. Sorry.
Excuse me. This is for Mr. Heilemann. You mentioned that there is a group of 4 people who have surrounded the president prior to his election and currently. And in addition to his cabinet, he has 32 approximately SARs. What is he attempting to try to expand this and show his ability to bring in additional people, or what is your take on that with the SAR additions?
Yeah, I think there are, to a large extent, my view is that the people that Barack Obama has chosen for his cabinet are, by and large, extraordinarily competent and accomplished public servants, some of them extraordinarily so. And you look at people like Hillary Clinton in the State Department, you look at Bob Gates at the Defense Department, not only are they extraordinary public servants, but they're the kind of public servants that a member of another party, if John McCain had won in 2008, you could easily have seen Hillary Clinton and Bob Gates in his cabinet, arguably in those same jobs. At the same time, there's no question that although Obama has surrounded himself with some very good people, the role of the cabinet in this administration has been one of not one of extraordinary power relative to changing Barack Obama's mind. And when I talk about the 4 people that he relies on, I don't mean to say that they are the only people who matter in American government, but to the extent that when it comes to presidential decision making, And when it comes to those very difficult decisions where the president needs to turn to someone, not just on matters of substance, but on matters of his personal standing, when he needs to hear bad news, when he needs to get to have someone tell him the toughest things that presidents sometimes need to hear, it's a very small circle in that context. And I think Barack Obama has done actually a reasonably good job in terms of managing the federal government, both through his cabinet departments, and also through some of those czars that you mentioned. Again, many of them doing, I think, actually pretty good work on the administrative level. But they are not people who have the ear of the president when it comes to making really big decisions in the White House.
Over here.
I'd like your comments or observations on the use or abuse of teleprompters by Obama. It seems like dating back to the Democratic Convention in 2004, it seems to me that 90% of the speeches he makes are just words, but the question is, whose words?
All yours, buddy.
I am unfamiliar with a president in my lifetime who has not used a teleprompter frequently and has not had a massive team of speechwriters who have crafted the words that he speaks every day. There are moments when it's in smaller settings. I think it's a little surprising sometimes that President Obama is as scripted as he is in those settings. But I think it would be unfair to say that he is dramatically different from his predecessors in terms of his reliance on teleprompters or on speechwriters in terms of the words that he utters in almost every other public setting.
That was a much better answer than I would have given.
Over here.
Yes, I'd like to drop back. After the Florida debacle of 2000, do you think that Al Gore should have tried again in 2004? And if so, what might have been the results?
It's a really good question. Running for president, I think it's clear from anybody who follows it or reads the book, it's hard, and I think your heart really has to be in it. And his heart wasn't in running again, and I think he saw that if he did run again, it would be a really polarizing thing, that it would be in some ways a relitigation of the bitterness of 2000. Now, we have now had 3 straight presidents who have been and have governed in times of extraordinary polarization. And so I think he chose not to, in part for personal reasons, but also I know that on his mind was the fact that the country wouldn't be able to move on, and the importance of presidential elections being about the future and not the past. I suspect, again, I don't feel strongly about it, and it's such a hypothetical that there's no way to know for sure, but I suspect he would have won. John Kerry, who is not as adept a politician as Al Gore, and that's saying something, John Kerry got close to winning, and it wouldn't have taken a much better effort for the Democrat to win that year. So again, it's impossible to know how it would have progressed, but if you just dropped Gore into that race, I think he probably would have won.
And we have time for just one last question we'll take right here.
I'm interested in your interpretation of 2 aspects of Obama since the election. One is his approach to the healthcare debate and what seemingly were the tactics of Saul Alinsky in terms of saying that he was intending to do the opposite, or really camouflaging what he really had in mind in terms of the cost, some things that he's not a dumb guy. So how would you interpret that aspect? And coupled with that, I'm curious what your explanation is for Obama's unusual approach of bowing in strange places.
Again, I defer.
That is so unfair.
Yeah. Those are so totally your questions. I'll do one if you'll do the other. How about that? And you can go first.
Okay, I'll do okay, you can do the second one.
Okay.
Well, on healthcare, I'm not sure I totally understand the premise of the question. There is obviously a huge amount of debate over what the long-term fiscal impact of the healthcare reform will be and what its long-term cost is. We do have a Congressional Budget Office that had to score all of these plans. There's obviously, again, in our hyper-partisan culture, there's a lot of debate over the CBO, but not, I don't think, a huge amount about its independence. I mean, there is some debate about whether the CBO systematically underestimates the long-term cost of things, but I don't think that, given that every plan that the Senate put forward, that the House put forward, and that the President ultimately signed was scored by the CBO, I'm not sure there was much room for a shell game with respect to the costing out of the plan. I think for a lot of people, a more, and I'll speak now more to the President's supporters than to his detractors, I think there was many of them were befuddled by the tactics that he employed in not being more straightforward about what he wanted to see in a health care plan. And there were reasons for that in terms of legislative tactics and legislative strategy. But there were many people who were supporters of the President who wanted to see him come out and plant a stake more firmly, who thought that would have been better politics for him to come out and say exactly what he wanted and then campaign for that, or at least be more forthright about some of the absolute principles that he would not give in on, as opposed to essentially taking the attitude, which was that a bill that met very minimalist objectives would be declared a success. And I think for many people who are fans of the President, or are supporters of the President, or are Democrats, there was some frustration that the notion that the health care bill became a debate that was more about trying to get a win on the board than about actually trying to fix the problem. And I think that may be one area where the President's detractors and his allies, some of his allies at least, see eye to eye. That although the health care bill was in the end at least a short-term political victory for him, the long-term verdict is still out, that it is probably not going to address the long-term problem, either in terms of the health care cost curve or in terms, in fact, of ensuring all Americans. So there's some degree of consensus around that from, again, friends and foes alike.
Sir, just confirm for everybody that you and I have never met, right? Is it right? We've never met? We met at the signing, but you and I, until today, we never met. I'm gonna just use my Karnak. You watch more Sean Hannity than Keith Olbermann, don't you? Am I right? You watch them both. All right, so I'm not right. I think my sense is you asked that from a point of view, right? So let me give you what my sense of the reality. And I think there's two parts. One is, unlike the people who have preceded him, his immediate predecessors, a governor of Texas who had been the son of a president, the governor of Arkansas, a long-serving figure in Washington who'd been vice president, a former governor of California. No one comes into the office totally prepared to do the job. You can have the best resume in the world, and there are parts of being president that are really hard. I think he is a more casual person than most of our recent presidents, and he's got to get used to a lot of the theatrical and ceremonial aspects of the job. So I think some of the incidents you're referring to are simply his self-consciously trying to react to a situation, and not, as some commentators on the right have said, a reflection of a mindset about America that is out of step with the way he should be or the way most Americans are. That having been said, there is a huge debate in this country that's been going on in a big way in the last few presidential campaigns. There's one group that says we need to be more international as a country, that we need to work more with international organizations, that military operations should be more multilateral. And then there's another group that says, more associated with the Republican Party, that says America can never work in coalition in a way that might undermine our national security interests, and that the way the UN operates and other international organizations operate is really deleterious to our interests, and at times can threaten our sovereignty. There's no question that Barack Obama fits into that first group, and that in that way he is out of step with the strong beliefs of a lot of Americans. I do not think that animates the incidents you're talking about. I do not think that mindset causes him to be unaware of the importance of the sovereignty of the United States or overly deferential to people from other countries. That having been said, I think whatever you or others might superimpose over his motivations is true, but not causing him to bow at inopportune times.
Great.